Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon, co-author with Peter Vale of the digital book on Practice as a Way of Being. Find it at mylibrary.world. And now to our show. Well, here is another conversation with my son, Dave, who has been looking at human behavior at the conversational level and within to the brain and everything that makes us tick in regard to each other and how we relate and how that translates into effective organizational and personal practice. And then along comes a very big fly in the ointment. Or maybe it's the sunrise over the horizon, but artificial intelligence is what we talk about this time. Being a lifelong teacher, I champion human intelligence as something that can grow and change and bring us to higher levels of life expectancy and performance. But then there's artificial intelligence, and it's coming along strong. So Dave actually thinks about this in very constructive ways and does a bit of research that he'll share us now. Dave teaching his dad something about artificial intelligence. In our last episode, the Dave and Dad show, I guess we could call it, toward the end, as we were talking about information in various aspects of how it feeds into social inaction in practice, I said, well, what about AI, Dave? You know, AI, every time I turn around, there's AI, and it's only the beginning. So you accepted my challenge, and this conversation will be what you've thought up about AI and learned so far. And I wish it didn't sound like someone expressing pain when they go, AI.
Yeah.
It's right away, it starts getting her hackles up.
Right.
Whereas human intelligence is high.
That's right. High intelligence.
I haven't biased stuffs already, have I? Because AI has a lot of positive attributes. So what do you think? What's been going on in your awareness about AI?
Well, it put me down a couple rabbit holes. And probably if you were to look up the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's a psychological condition where you study a few things and think you know all about it. So, like, I needed to learn what computational neural networks were. So I found literally 5 minutes to learn neural networks on YouTube. And so that's what I'm basing that knowledge on. But
Okay.
It was a nice summary, so we'll see. But so I'll kind of do it as a set of conjectures and points, and then we'll see whether I make all the connections to what we've been talking about and all our other things. But I think it's a nice example of how, well, first, it's an extension of what we were talking about in the last episode, which was information and information processing by the brain and under this Enaction model that we've been developing. And so it makes a nice contrast. Where are computers now? How close is it to what the brains do? Is it anything like the brain does? Is there something fundamentally different about brains and neurons and neural systems and even living systems that's different than computation that can be done through other physical means like circuits? So we'll go into that. I think I wanted to start with, just since your audience usually is people kind of not talking about these things, but listening to the news and and doing business and things like that. I had just a couple of points on what's the kind of the social context of AI, especially what's the hype and why is there so much hype and why is it now? I think we can safely say that the state of the art for AI is still in its infancy, even though it's been around. The parts of it have been around for almost um, probably well over 40 years now.
Yeah.
Yep. But what why now? I think some of it is I've heard critiques that some of it is it's just another way of building up a bubble in the tech industry, like the original internet bubble, the blockchain bubble, the this and that. It's the latest thing. But an interesting thing about these little chat GBT and Microsoft and Google spending billions on it is in part, and then lots of venture capitals going into it. And is in part what it does is it takes so much computational work and based all in cloud computing that you have to ask who owns the cloud computers. And so the hype gets lots of business for their cloud computers. Well, when someone, venture capitalists put together the latest AI toy, everyone jumps on it. They have to spend their billions to Amazon and Microsoft who own the cloud, and then it peters out, but they still collect it. So that's one cynical reason for exaggerating. Another is even the laws and the efforts, the horrors and people running to Congress and saying this will end civilization as we know it. Mm-hmm. We need laws to regulate it ahead of time. Well, some of the loudest people were these big companies. Mm-hmm. Who would have the resources, given regulations, to pay as many fleets of lawyers as needed to get their product out before the little guy who comes up with the ideas goes broke trying to meet the regulations and is bought up by the big guy. So mm-hmm. It's a nice way of jumping into a market where the big guys aren't quite there, and it does take innovation within companies that are kind of almost post innovation in their organizational structure mm-hmm. to some extent, like the Microsofts and the Googles. Mm-hmm. It's harder now to
they're more like utilities now.
Yeah, it's harder to have those, to really have the freedom to be the startup. They'd rather let startups be startups and then buy them afterwards.
Yeah.
But I think there are certainly some legitimate hypes, not immediately that Skynet's going to take over once, and spontaneous human like global mind is going to come up. But there are just the capacity to do lots of complex processing very quickly allows you to do some things that even affect my day job as in helping researchers manage data at Johns Hopkins, and also I specialize in data privacy for research data. So if someone were doing a medical study, their grant requires them to share their data online. They have to anonymize the data, which is very complicated in itself, but let's say they do so, and it's like, well, it's anonymized because all we're doing is a study on earlobes. So here's a big data set on earlobes. No one can recognize an earlobe, but the AI pattern matching, who knows? We may have unique enough earlobes, and some of these AIs can take all pictures of earlobes on Facebook and match it to us. And in some cases that, it could happen, but another factor in that is, yes, it could happen, but who's going to bother?
Yeah. Why no?
Yeah, because one of the factors in data privacy is you do think about the context. Is there any value in, knowing who has this earlobe?
Right.
And what's the computational costs? And so in many cases, that kind of gives a reason not to be too worried about a number of research topics that go out there. But with AI, like, when someone puts on one of these free cloud products, all of a sudden the cost of doing the attack goes way down.
Yes.
And when the cost is low, then people just say, what the hell, let's do it. Or they build a bot that does the attacks,
Yeah.
lets it run on its own. And then every now and then it pops up and says, oh, look, Clooney went to Johns Hopkins Hospital and for an operation, and we've now somehow matched his medical records.
To his
And
earlobe.
it's just because someone, put his earlobe online. So, it is a concern for, that's just one of several ethical concerns, but I thought I'd put that out there initially.
Yeah. Oh, and my very, very mediocre understanding is that it sort of started out for our use as a sort of a Google search tool with on steroids. In other words, that Google was merely giving us our web page choices when we'd search a word or even a sentence. And now with the chat tools, it, as you say, because they show me all the pictures of earlobes.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a database somewhere with tens of thousands of pictures of humans, and they can just, in fact,
or it doesn't even have to be an A database, but just scattered all over the web, and it's the algorithms that are just pulling things together for that moment and purpose.
So that's quite remarkable. And can you sense in that there's a similarity to a brain function and the way our brains can, pull stuff together, even if we're not aware of it doing it.
Yeah.
And then come up with
it is something similar to it, but I think what I want to lay out here is how similar, and kind of starting out with what is the basic idea of the computational neural network, and which is built originally to be analogous to neurons, not just in the brain, but just any even simple systems of neuron-like connections, but done as computation. And this is still, I believe, the basis of all AI, or at least the AI that gets the attention, is on this neural network technology, which was really started getting underway when I was still in grad school in the 90s. So I remember going to some classes where some of these people were trying to figure out social cognition. So they were taking the social science classes, trying to figure out what could be applied to neural networks. And I'm sure they're all making much more money than I am right now. But it's it's interesting, because what we talked about last time with the concept of information, and we kind of got into the history of Shannon's information model, and before that Alan Turing, and the kind of mechanical but also mathematical concept of computation, which went back to physicist John von Neumann. But really, computation comes down to the mathematics around passing information with instructions, and largely, for its efficiency's sake, done as binary code, ones and zeros, or on and off. And I put this in the interesting framework that Chiana Marletto, a physicist at Oxford, put together with an area of physics she and her original teacher and collaborator, David Deutsch, called construction theory. I won't go over too much of it, but the interesting way she defined information was as not in a vague way, but as very two simple physical tasks. When if both are present, then you have what is called information in a given transformation occurring between one or more systems. And the first part is flip, and the second part is copy. And the flip part is basically the task that is an expression of one or more permutations. The very simplest one is yes or no. But you can have more permutations. So like a cell can do many things, have many permutations of change at any given moment, biological cell, but a computer transistor and silicon just has the on-off switch, yes or no. So that's one part of it, the capacity to have more than one permutation. But the second part is what she calls copy, is the idea of transmitting a single signal such that one state at time one is copied, or it is kind of the causal reason for that, either that same state or a different state that reacts to the first state to occur at time two. So we gave the model of someone flashing a light on shore, and then the light on the boat responds back.
Right.
One could consider that a completion of an information process. And you can define almost like a universal computation on that basis, because with those simple relationships, you can calculate anything that can be calculated. That's one of the things that Alan Turing proposed, and has become, even within her area of physics, a notion of kind of a information-based physics that should extend to all areas of reality, including even quantum level, which I might get into finally towards the end. But for now, let's think of this definition of information and in the relationship of programming. So you're programming a certain execution of this copy path based on starting input and output. A very simple computational model says if this, then that, and the instructions are then essentially inherent to the rule. Transformation happen in a certain way, but the concept of neural networks adds kind of a layer of we could sort of think of an abstracted layer of processing between the input and the output of more traditional computation. So what you have is kind of, you can picture the classic kind of connection of neurons as though they were little dots with lines in between, and nodes and lines of connection in between them, but where you have kind of a layer of such nodes as the input, another layer as the output, but in between are what they call hidden layers. And the hidden layers are doing additional computation between input and output that isn't quite the same as a simple program. It's more like what at least originally was supposed to be modeled as what biological systems do, which is they do what the neural network theory calls a feed-forward process. The feed-forward meaning that at the input stage, you have certain conditions that would be what Marla will call the flip state, the ones and zeros, what could happen. But before they can get to the output level, the network of connections has to meet some threshold conditions within these inner layers, that if those threshold conditions are met, then that inner layer spits out a yes or a no to the next layer. So you could kind of think of the classic neuron, which has the dendrites collecting, spreading out and contacting at several points. All the other networks, neurons that's connected to. If it reaches a threshold, then it fires a signal out its axon, and then that axon firing is then gets carried on to the rest of the networks. But it's a very, very simple model of a neuron, and science is finding it's too simple. But but it's at least works for computation. So what you get is, if you have a system where you have to meet certain thresholds before something passes on, then you can have like parts that assemble a certain whole. So you can think of like a basic pattern recognition, like a square. You'll have some of the nodes of input being fire when you see an angle, fire when you see another one says fire when you see a straight line. Another one says fire when you see the orientation of up or down or left or right. Those together, if all of those are true in a certain order, then it hits the inner layer that's looking for that which constitutes a square. And when it sees that which constitutes a square, it gives the output, and then something else can make use of that output. So it's basically this concept of building an inner world or model that is based on a variety of inputs, and inputs that don't have to be exact. They can have layers of probability in order to make that connection.
Wow.
So to meet those thresholds, so you can be a little more sophisticated in something that does what used to be called fuzzy logic, where it's it doesn't have to have exact programming. In a sense, it could even do a little bit of its own programming. What it's doing is what we've talked about with brains and living systems as kind of a predictive modeling, because it is looking at what the outcome should be given the past, and then test it against what ideally the system would then test whether it's believing there was a square still holds up over time to those input conditions, so that basically you have the model of the system providing a certain relevance for certain events that are oriented towards prediction, but then have a confirmation phase, and then the system, the neural network system itself, then is trying to meet a certain level of accuracy by its continued refining of its algorithm. And they call this a cost function minimization. What's the overall cost of getting things wrong, and then trying to learn and get things more correct. And this learning is, when you hear the term machine learning, that's usually what it's referring to. It's referring to needing lots and lots of training data, lots of different ways squares present themselves in the real world, and building up a range of these kind of threshold connected networks that will get more sophisticated. But the interesting thing about these kind of middle hidden layers is that they become more and more complicated and complex, but especially if you start adding little recurrent feedback loops that make it a little more self-organizing, self-repairing in itself before it presents the results to an observer. What the computer scientists quickly find they get is something where they actually don't have a good sense of what's going on anymore in those inner layers, because it's getting so complex that it makes no real sense to then kind of print out all the numbers crunching that's actually going on, and just kind of worrying about how good the output is. So you get like training data, I work with reviewing a lot of research proposals in my job, and there's lots and lots of proposals that come out for people who want to get collect lots and lots of MRI scans of the body. And one of the interesting things they're doing is using pattern recognition to like quickly figure out what's a liver and what's a spleen and what's a heart. And normally that takes a person looking at it, looking at the image and having to do it in 3D and lay out in sometimes blurry lines what's a liver. And one data set we're just releasing on our data repository, they did that with AI, and what would have taken humans 30 years to do, they were able to compute in just a couple of weeks. of just the ability to say spleen and label it, liver and label it. So it's amazing things
It
that can be
seems so
done. Yeah.
simple, but it isn't.
Yeah, because if you really, if you were to look, try to like, okay, let's print out how it made that decision, you get, there'd be another 30 years worth
You'd
of
fill a
ones and
building of
zeros.
yeah.
So it's this interesting that so it's another kind of at least analogy to how we experience the world, because we have brains turning along with those hidden layers, and what we experience is the observer, becoming the observer of that. Yeah, and so like tweaking these programs is more like, getting other people to behave better by giving them instructions which they may or may not follow.
Now,
So
there's the rub in a way.
yeah,
Once the output is, it sounds like the output's never completely out. It seems like it's the algorithms just keep churning. But
right.
say you say, all right, stop. I wanna look at this anatomy,
Yeah,
and then it becomes the human role to interpret,
yeah,
look at consequences, and imagine if I have a patient that looks like this versus someone. I mean, you're doing all of that additional thinking,
right.
but it's shortened the amount of time it takes you to get to that point of observation.
Yeah,
Then the observing becomes part of what you do.
yeah, but you're letting the computer do the grunt work of
The grunt work, yeah.
indexing, categorizing, and all that kind of stuff, which as librarians we're afraid may take our jobs one day.
I thought of you guys.
I saw another proposal where someone was basically creating an AI librarian for astronomy. It's like, uh-oh.
That one went
So,
into the round file.
yes, I said, yeah.
No,
Yeah.
no, no, no.
It was IRB approval. So I could have said, no, you can't do this, but I don't think I have that power. But
Well,
in any
it'll
case,
come.
yeah,
But it means there's an ascendant role for the person for whom that work is done, and
right.
then now I can do something more cerebral or more creative or whatever.
Yeah, that's the thought. But luckily, so far mistakes still occur. So one of these things where the Microsoft and Google launched heavily into AI stuff is that you get mistakes, and you get things that I think are generally called hallucinations,
Yeah,
or
I've
kind
heard
of
of that.
invented
I do those
correlations.
myself,
Yeah, we do it on our own, but we expect computers to be smarter, and
Yes.
so like these large language models, which is really an impressive thing that gets our phones to talk to us in language. But someone was doing like did a search of their own journal articles using these AI things, and then it invented several titles that they never wrote. But then he said, but some of these were really good titles that I
Cool
ought to have.
titles.
But then another kind of a journalist who was left wing, did more kind of left wing things, had articles that were decidedly right wing and somewhat racist with his name on it come up. So
that
he
could
didn't like
smart.
yeah, so he didn't like that, and I don't know that they always think Silicon Valley's people who build these things are kind of lefties themselves, so it must be
Like a trick, huh? But
or I don't know. It's not like right wingers got in and changed the code. So
well, does it complete the learning circuit then when we humans receive the output and we find it's hallucinatory or it's off in some way? How then can we feed that back so that they can improve the overall AI? Or do
yeah,
we?
it's challenging. I mean, some of these ones, like the one I looked at the other day, was really kind of relying on the chat function but they can only do it so much. Whereas if you look at real human dialogue, that repair is immediate and very
Yes.
carefully done, and we don't even realize how carefully and thoroughly we repair each other's understandings of each other during talk.
Yes, like we're doing right now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
both at the language level, but even at the emotional and social relationship level. All of
Right.
that's going on constantly. So, that's that's one of a number of things on my list that make this, if not impossible, at least something that would be in the future. But I kind of getting into that point, what you can see is that where AI is we shouldn't be unimpressed by it. It is, but it's quickly getting to that at the processing stage between chaos and more complex emergent organization, which we might be tempted to call self-organization, because it does
Yeah.
have these internal feedbacks, and they are paying attention to biology and how it's being done and evolution and things of that sort to try to incorporate that into these systems. So we can say, all right, well, we're almost there, because is this what we've been talking about when we talk about inaction, social inaction, and cognitive inaction, even earlier when we're talking about living systems and
Right.
self-organization.
Right.
I mean, so kind of going back to my basic definition of inaction, which is performance, a domain or environment brought forth and something that's rule-like and warranting the accuracy of something in the basis of what ought to be known and what was just done. So, you could kind of see these neural networks as certainly being a performance-based thing,
Yeah.
task-oriented.
Sounds like the same thing.
But they do this kind of abstracting, which is much more like a domain of activity, not just simple outputs, but a domain of activity and relevance that has this feedback and is learning over time and adapting. So this sense of something that's abstracted, and also kind of rule-like, having this based on this feedback based on accuracy and relevance for this predictive modeling that's going on. And there even that gets into what we talked about in past episodes about the Markov blanket computations and free energy minimization that Carl Friston, the kind of mathematical oriented neuro, I guess he's a neurobiologist, psychology. He talked about the effects. Basically, what this sort of information processing might be for neural networks is closer to what he calls free energy minimization. So free energy is what they might call the cost function, the difference between the prediction and the actual as it's measured interactively over time. So and what he defines information as is the spectrum of the unpredicted real events. So the more, almost in a way, if once you predict something, the more alternative choices you have in that prediction can be defined in itself as the information that kind of hits you when you interact with the world. A world of too much information means that you've done a poor job of anticipating what's happening, and then you have to do more work, more energy cost in order to figure that out. Whereas free energy minimization means that you've really predicted well, and you can then reserve your attention to the new things, the new relevant things. So as you're driving, most of the rest of the brain is kind of minimizing the conscious attention to that. But then the events that pop up are the ones where you can then marshal more energy to figure it out. And I think neural networks, I think a lot of people would build neural networks with that kind of system in mind. Carl Friston, one of the reasons he's so highly cited is that the neural network people have really gotten into his work. even earlier than that, I talked in the past in the 80s and 90s about the work of Gerald Edelman,
Yeah.
neuropsychologist who talked about reentrance. He was building these little robots that had a were more like did their interaction with the world more like these neural networks, because he added like basically a little emotion
Oh,
sensor,
really?
the value evaluation, saying this I'm not going to do this because it essentially hurts,
Yeah.
but I feel pleasure doing that. And
Yeah.
so there's even people kind of putting emotions. There's even AI scientists working with Mark Solms, who's a uh, psychiatrist, and who I did an episode on his model of consciousness, which I still
Remember
really
that?
like, which was looking at the action of the emotions feeding down to the brainstem that become kind of a basic valence that then gets goes up the stack of emergence to real experience that we would actually experience as conscious awareness,
Mhm.
which at that point gets that, well, all right, is what AI doing anything like conscious awareness? And that,
That's sort of the big question, isn't it?
yeah,
The
yeah,
grail in a way.
it's both a grail, and it's kind of, I think in the ethical thing, it's like what we wouldn't want to happen, at least not anytime
Well, I
soon.
know.
um, so, how far along are we before accidentally having uh, this conscious awareness, since we don't really even know quite what it is to have conscious awareness? What is it? Not just compute whether a thing is a square, but know what, or whether a thing is red, but know what it is about to be read, and have the experience of being read and redness as something somehow
Yeah.
unique, and awareness of
Yeah.
that. What was called that, the hard problem of consciousness, which some say will never be figured out, but maybe the AIs will unexpectedly achieve it.
Well, it'll either that or it'll help us humans support our humans in coming to a better understanding and
Right.
achieve it that way. Our own consciousness. See, I'm back to my first I versus high, and human intelligence to me at this very late stage of my career is a mission, and yet as I've spouted out, oh, we need to enhance in human intelligence in order to match and counterbalance the artificial. Well,
Right.
then I thought, well, how the hell do I do that?
Right.
I mean, it's not an IQ, it's not a fixed number. There's in our conversations, I've got a better sense of the workings of what produces these moments of awareness and growth and learning. But how do we accelerate that? How do we amplify that? How do we
Yeah.
uh, get more of us humans working at a higher level of the use of our native abilities is sort of one of the frontiers that I'm kind of interested in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that would be the, again, the kind of the dream of where technology maybe can enhance that, but then again, um, maybe by the same token, maybe it limits that ability, because the economic system may prefer that we just kind of be the quiet consumers of
Well, that's it. I mean,
of cheaper labor that could be increasingly done by machines.
yeah, and really, that's where, to me, it's a break point, because
Yeah.
there will be a cost associated with finding better ways of teaching, of
Mhm.
stimulating learning, all the rest, beyond anything we've ever seen before.
Right.
And so the question is, will society, through its economic system, support that cost so that we can break through on human growth and development
Right.
and intellectual uh, heights of achievement, versus leave people sort of as they are and then plow the money into the artificial side. Well, for one thing, the artificial machine just keeps running. It doesn't
Yeah.
need a bathroom break or
Right.
get
And
grumpy on Fridays or
yeah, and
any of the.
increasingly, the more we're pulled into that, we're pulled into the hive mind type thing where we
Exactly.
don't have to do the work of thinking, because it does take work. This is what we're talking about.
It takes work, and it's there's got to be some pleasure to it. We've
Right.
talked way back to your shame and rage and your pleasure and
Right.
pain, but uh, the way we construct opportunities for human growth and development should be pleasurable as much as possible.
Mhm.
And I think then of the sort of the draconian pictures of the rows of wooden desks with
Right.
arms in schoolrooms that have not changed basically for over 200 years,
Right.
and plowing these little human beings into these bases and holding them there for 6 hours or 7.
Yeah, with
And
rote
they
memorization in a world where they can pick up their phone and
see
have all
there,
the yeah.
there's to me, there's a big rub,
Mhm.
because if most all of the traditional ways of uh, preparing people
Mhm.
for life is to prepare their memories and
Right.
to say that when they leave with the knowledge, as
Right.
if it's an acquisition,
Yeah.
which is not at all where it is. I mean, what Peter Bale got me thinking about many years ago was that, knowledge is, if anything, within moments can be completely erroneous and obsolete
Yeah.
based on
So
the rate of change. So here we are,
right, right, in that balance. So I guess what we could do is think about what is it that our brains still do better than computers, at least for now. And the question is
Yes.
whether it is for now or whether it will always be the case. So we could kind of think of what can it do now and then speculate on the future. But I think what we can say now is that AI is despite neural networks mimicking brains to some extent, they are not the same as biological computation, if we can even call it computation, because you could also call it, um, you know, the process of what living systems do is live.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we talked last time about the concept of like autopoiesis.
Yep.
Uh, Basically, it's like a computer chip has a steady amount of electricity that goes through it that gets it to do mechanical things, and if you do too many mechanical things, you have to put more energy into it, which is why these AI things are costing enough electricity to should ought to make any someone worrying about global warming to never turn on their browser because they're burning down trees and coal and stuff. But in any case, um, the brains really are actually quite energy efficient, even though they use most of our metabolic energy, or a disproportionate amount of it anyway. But what it's doing, what the brains are doing, is that they're trying to keep these neuronal groups at a far from equilibrium state.
Yeah.
It's doing something that is kind of keeping a certain that balance between chaos and complexity that I talked about,
Yep.
and keeping at a state where there's a controlled indeterminacy. Um, so it's not, and also one where you have lots of, we talked about that information as flip and copy, where the flip part has many, many permutations, and the copy can go in many different directions. And what you have is the massive complexity in its interoperability, and also in these levels of emergence where the small processes become incorporated into more complex capacities for larger systems. You could literally look at evolution in that way, as both the simple competition amongst early forms of life, or even little strands of RNAs. Some people have speculated, but then they become increasingly assimilated. So RNA gets assimilated in, first you have chemical catalysts. They kind of assemble into something called RNA that gets assimilated into structures that create DNA, and then the cells, and then cells almost immediately have neuron-like activity.
Yeah.
Something called possibly in their microtubule systems by which they also reproduce, and then that into actual neurons and brains, and then what we're talking about is a social level of talk that then allows social group life. Now,
That's a
so
lot.
yeah, so it's a lot. I mean, Marletto says this. She would still call this computation. Even by biological means, you can do computing, and it could kind of what Alan Turing talked about was like a universal computer. Everything is computable.
Mhm.
Since it follows deterministic causal laws or rules, in part, even though it's complex, it's still basically consistently physical tasks that can be described by math in a way. So, that's, we'll see if we get kind of build on that topic. But I guess a real quick path through all our other podcasts on what computers would need to do to kind of more fully mimic human intelligence. I drew from my favorite American pragmatist philosopher, George Herbert Mead, which taking his philosophy of the act and social, then applies well to social psychology, and language also applies well to neuronal group self-organizing systems. I talked about how they've been characterized as acts. So, which is basically what we talked about already in terms of predictive processing and relevance testing, which you could kind of characterize as what he called meaning. But
Mhm.
his model nicely emphasizes like sensory motor relationships. There's a lot more of this touching the world and adjusting and manipulating it that
Yes.
becomes part of the act that computer AI may not quite know how to do, but maybe robots need to learn. And then, but there's also that notion of the impulse, the valence, which is very much an emotion, uh, um, kind of motive that carries through the act until there's some sort of a consummation in which the
Yeah.
act is either changed or destroyed, moves on, and then but also that learning moment that comes from that evaluative part of this what he calls hypothesis testing,
Yeah.
acts hypothesis testing.
Yeah.
Um, so, can computers do that? Can AI do that? Can computers really handle emotions properly? And do they need to? Um, so, we talked about Mark Solms giving an argument why the brainstem has to have, consciousness, conscious awareness, starting with feelings to actually
Mhm.
feel. You feel your feelings. They're felt. And they're
Yes.
felt. Who are they felt by? They're felt by an observer. And where's this observer? The observer, I want to argue, is something that's coming out of these living systems in a way that isn't really understood. I'm
Mhm.
not even sure if it's right myself, but I'm thinking of it as a way to characterize this abstractness, in this in this relationship that may be what's characterized by this Markov blanket notion, where you have systems built of surfaces and internal children. The children interactions are what keep the overall surface parent reactions in place, but the interaction of living systems and neuronal group systems is surface to surface, in which it's much more like the whole adjusting to another whole. And I think it literally is like the one whole is an observer of the other whole, as a kind of a mathematical result of this happening. Um, and it's easier to see this at larger levels of the brain, like we talked about Ian McGilchrist in the left and right hemispheres of the brain, where it's very obvious that there's very independent, asymmetrical, specialized things going on, in which maybe the left brain and right brain literally talk to each other, with the left half of the brain, the right half of the brain largely um, uh, constraining the left half. The left
Yeah.
half is churning along, doing these acts and categorizing and acting. It's really the left half of the brain is acting much more like an AI computer neural network.
Ah, there's an
But
interesting analogy.
but the right half is thinking about the wholes and the
Yeah.
global and the intuition and bringing it
Yeah.
all together and giving it a big picture. So has anyone developed that for AI yet? So
Well,
maybe, yeah.
take that, artificial world.
Yeah.
I'm actually feeling a lot better about our human capabilities, Dave, as a result of what you've shared.
Yeah, there's lots to
Uh,
do. I mean, well, I'll add one more thing. Language. What's language? I mean, we can applaud the effort to make our phones understand us, at least in that sense. What they've done
yes,
with the raw rules of language took a lot of work, and it does a pretty good job.
it does. When I'm
But
texting, I see it's producing words that I.
yeah, but what our brains do, I talked about in terms of this first level, again with George Herbert Mead being a nice, putting it very nicely, this kind of first cognitive level, which is actually a conscious awareness that's shared with other animals, is a first level. It's hard enough to achieve with computers, but then added to that is a special thing that happens when you can hear your own voice,
Mhm.
and that it calls out the same meaning in myself as others, and then you get a world, a new level of consciousness that's built up of distinctions of the world, which we have described as enacted social action.
There you go.
So it gives this kind of aboutness of the world at the basic level, what it means to be read, and what it means to say a thing is read, and what it means to say a thing is read for another person who you're talking with, and achieving through interaction that ongoing understanding. And there are ways of modeling that and getting more understanding of how that works. My methods of the methodological tradition in social linguistics that I learned, conversation analysis, is one way to see these patterns.
Yeah.
I talked about the diagraph at Du Bois model of very systematic ways you can see work done through talk, of doing things like
Mhm.
contradicting someone, or you're even repairing the details of the relationship through what one does and the
Mhm.
gestures and all that big mix. So we're looking at a lot of complexity. So
Yes.
it's not going to take, it's going to take a while. Now my school, Johns Hopkins, some group of billionaires have invested a few billion in hiring, like, I think over 100 faculty members in AI to start a whole new institute. They're massively going into this and pouring tons of resources into it.
Yeah. Well,
So there's a lot of interest, but
there sure is.
do they? Hopkins has a great way of hiring a person and then not quite being there with the contextual resources that they would need to maybe figure out what we see here as a whole university worth of understanding, to have to come together even to approach some of these issues that we're talking about to get to this next
Well,
level.
I have to give whoever engineered that some credit for at least trying to reconfigure an institution to have a focus like that.
Right.
Because the traditional departments, as they've stood for how many years, even in the engineering programs, are pretty staid. And I just can't imagine a highly specialized preparation at the graduate level breaking someone out to be able to handle even what you've just described, Dave, because
Right.
they can get in there and they can play with the numbers and the flips and the copies, but do they have this larger sense of human society and the human potential in the best sense of the word? Because it's been used so much, it's almost like, what is it? But I think there's an enormous amount of potential that can be brought out in humans, uh, existing and anew as they're born. And I'd love to see the same kind of concentration of dollars and smart people around that issue.
Yeah.
Now we're building a really new balanced university. We've got
Right.
the humanities, as we used to call them,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
social sciences and all of
Philosophers, and
that.
yeah. Yeah.
And then we've got the technologists and all of that. are they ever going to get together and have coffee? I don't
Yeah,
know.
there's a little bit of that, but we know academics.
No,
It's hard nut to crack as far
our
as what's
reward
happening
system
there.
doesn't necessarily allow for that. So there's some
Yeah.
change, but you are
I'm
definitely
the
younger than
librarian. They can come and ask the librarian, and
you're in the,
I will charge a small fee, but
of course you will,
I will explain all these things we're talking about. Again,
but
it's
you're in the
Dunning-Kruger
middle.
system disorder, but they don't need to know that.
No, they
So
don't. But they do, but they should understand, as I'm seeing it at this moment, that I described this, the orbits of different attention,
right.
technology, artificial intelligence, human, and so forth. Where's the library is always in that. I mean, the
Yes.
library is in it all the time,
Yeah.
in the furthest reaches
That's the
of a
argument our dean's
university.
making.
It's the library is the interstitial.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the not the left brain and the right brain. It's the third brain for an institution.
The midbrain, keeping it all
Yeah,
together.
it's a midbrain, and you're kind of in a good place to see all that happening, and maybe throw in some of your own contributions. So
Yeah, we'll
I'm
see.
delighted with how this conversation went. You've taken away a lot of the anger, not really anger that I was feeling. I was feeling like we were being swamped,
Yeah.
and
That's
I
why I
don't like
started
that
out.
feeling.
That's why I started out with why the news media is hyping, because
Yeah.
they've got their advertisers
Yeah, and it's a
saying, hey,
bubble. There's
yeah,
no question it'll be a bubble, and that's sort of the way it goes. But uh, fundamentally, if, for example, in the health domain, as you mentioned, they can uh, take 30 years
yeah,
of human drudgery and pull it together in 2 weeks
yeah,
to give them a better platform upon which to build
yeah,
new treatment concepts.
yeah. And that's one thing my school's going to really focus on, because they've
I
got
think so,
office
because
medical and
you got a great medical school,
yeah.
and
So
so,
those things would be good. Hey, if we want to take a few more minutes,
yeah.
I have I again, Dunning-Kruger, but I almost think I understand quantum computing.
Oh, I don't know. Can we get this in this? I don't
Why
want to
not?
overrun our broadcast
Well,
time.
let's put it in and see what happens.
All right.
Because I only know so
We'll
much,
call
but
it the beginning of the next episode. So throw
we'll,
out a little bit of
we'll
quantum
see. Yeah. So I'm saying this mostly because in the book by Chiara Mileto, the science of can and can't, she does get into quantum computing, and also her the construction theory with David Deutsch, physicist David Deutsch, really was one of the launching points of quantum computing. So we talked about the complexity of the brain. Now there's some rabbit holes I won't get into, where people can Google on their own. Roger Penrose, the 2020 Nobel laureate in physics, did work on black holes, but he has an interesting kind of argument why computers will never fundamentally can't achieve consciousness. And an anesthesiologist who we worked with and kind of went down certain rabbit holes, but ones that are rather interesting on the nature of microtubules within neurons, that and to the frustration of physicists and neuroscience people and philosophers alike, it seems like microtubules do something special and might involve the brain in quantum processing at a certain level.
The brain.
So here's the odd, if let's just pose that that's even a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what's interesting with quantum computing, that what that does is it takes the normal if then thing and puts it into a kind of almost a different level of reality. So it's hard to summarize this quickly, but if you get on YouTube or Google anything about quantum physics, you'll see things about the nature of superposition. Particles have the wave act as though they're either waves or particles simultaneously by at the very small level by basically being what's called superposition. An electron will look like a wave that is indeterminate until there's a certain interaction with something else that has been kind of called an observer or measurement process, which gets people confused, but it's basically an interaction with something will collapse what could be one state or another into a given state. What Marletto does is we talked about information having flip properties. So normally a macro object like a computer circuit will have a yes or no, and it could either be yes or no. But at the very small things, the subatomic particles or even electrons and photons can actually have certain permutations that are possible that are happening in essence at the same time. And while they are in that kind of quantum indeterminate fluctuation, they cannot be copied as such in that superimposed state. The copy function is actually what makes it collapse into one state. So like the electron is now at this level because there's been an interaction that's what's called created decoherence. So what quantum computers are doing is through massive amounts of magnetism, or I don't even know how they do it technically, they are able to generate these superposition states of particles, which are called qubits. And while the qubit exists, it's very difficult to keep them not interacting with anything in the world, like an air particle. Because if they do, they collapse and no longer become useless. But during that incredibly brief time when they are in that superposition, you're able to do essentially thousands of computer computations at once. Because what you've done is, we talked about the neural network and that hidden level between the input and the output. Rather than being lots of parallel processing, it's more like a massive indeterminate state, which if you set it up just right, does lots of computations at the same time, literally the same time, or literally no time at all, because we're almost in a place where there is no normal time, because thermodynamics are not occurring until there's been a collapse. And they also talk about the quantum state being reversible. Things are going backwards or forwards, as though they were going backwards or forwards in time. So it's like so it allows you to do like these very complex math computations, which would take 1,000 years with regular computing in a matter of seconds. And it also has interesting things like, while the thing is in this quantum entangled state, it actually has an extra layer of information that only exists for that entangled state, so that you could have something that's basically perfect encryption of information that doesn't exist in normal reality, because once you collapse it, you have to then reproduce that entangled state in order to get it back again. So there's kind of this super memory that lives in
oh my God,
in the quantum foam somehow, but not in what we would call the real time space-time world. So what they're playing with things that will seem like magic, and who knows, maybe it will work. And the crazy idea is, if the microtubules of our brains do this, then what the hell does that mean? So that's what gets what gets the neuroscientists going nuts when they start hearing about those ideas. But on the other hand, they're finding 300 distinct types of neurons that all do different things. And so they're already dealing with unbelievable complexity just in the brain. So so I'll leave you one more point. That'll blow your mind. I love going down rabbit holes at the end.
I know.
So
there's got to be a rabbit in there somewhere.
Oh yeah. So one thing that Marletto says is that she talks about the if she's sort of a believer for now in the idea that everything can be computed because it follows the laws of physics, including something what John von Neumann called not just the universal computer, but the universal constructor. The universal constructor would be something that uses computation to take apart the quantum foam and put together new electrons and atoms and break everything down into parts that can then be reassembled as computation. So, you think of the Star Trek.
I was going to say,
Star Trek, the Star Trek
up.
transporter and the Star Trek replicator, where you go up and say, give me tea, Earl Grey, hot, and it just appears. So those are, the universal constructor technologies. Now, here's the crazy point. She says, well, maybe one day this is possible for humans because we're on that direction. Well, I like to always say, okay, there are a lot of planets out there, and they've been around for 1 billion years. Other civilizations, if that's possible, have already done it. And what does that mean? And I think of von Neumann, or maybe science fiction writers taking von Neumann's idea, said, if that's been done, then why are we still here? Because those smart civilizations would have already taken apart the entire universe and reassembled it in the way they wanted to. So it kind of leaves us with a couple of fun things that you can find lots of YouTube discussions on. Has that already been done? And it's just been put together the way that they wanted to by an agreement, which probably took an agreement of every other smart civilization that while was taking apart one universe, they'd hit another one that was also taking apart their part of the universe, and they'd have a colossal war, so they'd have to agree or destroy the universe.
Oh my God. Now here's the concluding observation from your father.
I haven't even finished.
I'm the cause of all this, because when I could have told you nice, simple little stories when you were 2 or 3, and here's the piggy and there's the cow and all that, we started going crazy with imagination and creating characters and all that.
Yeah,
Davey and all and I now look at you. You're pulling together the constructors of a whole different universe than the one we think exists. But I love it. It's wonderful. And
yes.
This has been a great episode, and
so
we'll pick up on it.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Plenty of sci-fi movies out there, ideas. So you could approach us for that.
Yeah, there are. But
some screenplays.
I think we started sci-fiing back when you were still in diapers. So now I'm in diapers and I'm sci-fiing. So that symmetry works.
Right,
okay, Dave. Well, thank you so much. This has been very enlightening.
Yeah, we'll figure out some other fun way to go with all this next time.
Social inaction.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. If you'd like to hear more, go to Podomatic, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. And please consider purchasing our book on practice as a way of being at mylibrary.world. It's a digital book with lots of features that you do not see in a conventional book. So once again, thank you, and I look forward to you listening again.